Hey people, welcome to the run testers and to our first run look at the new Polar Vantage M3. This is the latest running watch to land a smartwatch-style AMOLED touchscreen. It's the third in Polar's lineup behind the Grit X2 Pro and the Vantage V3 to take that tech on board. Now we've had the Vantage M3 in for just a few days. We've done some early testing, and in this video we're going to whip you through very quickly what's new with the Vantage M3, along with some early tests on the GPS heart rate and battery life performance. Plus we're going to give you our initial thoughts on the design and where this watch fits into the busy running watch landscape and Polar's own lineup. So let's get into our Polar M3 first look. Now, it's been 10 years since the launch of the original M400. I tested that watch back in the day. In fact, I think I've still got one somewhere in the cupboard. Things have moved on an awful lot since then. And let's start with a whistle-stop tour of what's new with the Polar Vantage M3. Now, what's maybe most interesting about the Vantage M3 is that it carries an identical suite of tools and features built on the same platform as you'll find in the Grit X2 Pro and the Vantage V3. That means that when new features are rolled out, they should come to all of those watches now across them. So you're going to get same features. So when you're looking at those watches, the main differences are going to come in the design and the build and the battery life and the durability, those kind of things. So let's do that first. Now, while the hero of the Polar Vantage M3 is that new 1.28-inch AMOLED display bringing a touchscreen to the M models for the first time, this new running watch is also smaller, thinner and lighter than the Vantage M2. It features a Gorilla Glass 3 display that's slightly smaller than the Grit X2 Pro and the V3, but it's also brighter at 1500 nits compared to 1050 on those other two watches, the X2 Pro and the V3. There is a stainless steel bezel. It comes in at 12 millimeters thick, 44 meters diameter, and it weighs in at 53 grams. It comes with two sizes of the standard 22mm swappable silicone bands. There's another length in the box so you can get a good fit. When it comes to the heart rate tech and the sensors, you get the latest Polar Elixir biosensing tech, which combines Gen 4 optical heart rate sensors with wrist ECG, so you can now do an orthostatic recovery test without the need for a chest strap. There's also a skin temperature sensor and SpO2 blood oxygen monitoring built into the watch. On GPS, the Polar Vantage M3 packs dual frequency GPS as well with L1 and L5. On battery life, the Polar Vantage M3 offers 30 hours in performance mode, 70 hours in eco mode, and 7 days in smartwatch mode. That's slightly shorter than you'll get from the Grit X2 Pro and the Vantage V3, but it's the same as you'll find on the Polar Pacer Pro and the older Vantage M2. The M3 also has a bigger memory and a faster processor. It's also waterproof to 50 meters. When it comes to features, the Polar Vantage M3 offers 150 sport modes and all the familiar training, recovery and health tools that you'll get on the Grit X2 Pro and the V3, including Training Load Pro, Nightly Recharge, Recovery Insight, Sleep Tracking, Boost from Sleep Score, FitSpot workout recommendations. You get FuelWise fueling support. All of those things are here as well in this watch. There are also at-rest fitness tests and performance testing for running, cycling and walking. Maps and navigation smarts are here as well. Those are also the same as the X2 Pro and the V3, including full colour offline maps with pre-installed maps for the US and Europe. There's other regions that you're available to download for free if you want to. There's also Komoot compatible routing, plus there's route guidance, back to start and trackback features. Beeline navigation to points of interest is coming in an update down the line, but it's not here just yet. When it comes to price, the Vantage M3 lands at £349 or $399.90 in the US.
So I've just come back from my first run with the Polar Vantage M3, as you can probably tell from this sweaty patch on my collar here. I think the first thing to talk about here is that the M3 is a drastically different looking watch from the M2. I think with the M2, Polar tried to play around with things here. I think ultimately looked at kind of having a more stylish looking watch, not so sporty ultimately, and I quite like the fact that they did that, and that was kind of, I think, a nice elements of the M2. I think with the M3, it's definitely kind of going back to its roots, playing a little bit more safe, definitely feels more in keeping the look with the kind of Vantage series and the Grit series as well. Definitely a bit of a Grit kind of look to it, probably the last generation, which is, yeah, absolutely fine, feels solid, you know, similar materials ultimately in that case. But yeah, I mean, as I say, I think it's, you know, Polar playing a little bit safe. It's nice to see that there are two kind of watch strap length options here, which I did have to change straight away, and it's very easy to do that ultimately. But the big story here is that screen. Now on the M2 you had a TFT display, you also had a very big bezel around the screen as well, and it really did, didn't give you much space in terms of that screen to play with. Now that has changed. We've got an AMOLED display here. It's less bezel, there still is bezel, and I would like to see less of that bezel still, but ultimately there is less. I think the AMOLED display is ultimately a lot nicer to look at. We've kind of seen it with the other Polar watches that have added AMOLED displays, and we're kind of catching up with the competition in terms of that, and it feels like a good quality display. I would like it to be a little bit bigger, but ultimately I think this is a step in the right direction for kind of the Vantage M series. Now, in terms of my running experience, so I've just done over an hour with the M3. I had also had the Apple Watch Ultra 2 with me on the other wrist, so kind of testing it against a kind of dual band kind of watch. I had that paired to a Polar H9 heart rate monitor chest strap as well too, so kind of monitoring the heart rate performance as well too. The big deal here, obviously, as well here is that you're getting mapping, which is great to see. I think particularly at this price point as well. So I used that a little bit, used the back to start feature as well too. I think in general, it felt pretty solid overall. Kind of looking at the distance tracking from the two watches after, there was a bit of a disparity there. So that would be something I'd want to keep an eye on. Things like average pace was very similar to the Apple Watch as well too. Looking into that kind of heart rate, which obviously that again is another change here. Moving to the kind of newer kind of sensor setup here from Polar. And on that run, I said it was pretty easy going. The heart rate was pretty good. Looked, from a kind of average heart rate point of view, kind of max heart rate point of view as well too. It felt pretty solid. Ultimately I want to see how it performs kind of at higher intensity. That's what will really tell me more about the sensor on the Vantage M3. And then kind of battery life as well too. Felt absolutely fine, and the kind of drop was kind of what I expected to see. I had the screen set to always on, but I didn't get a chance to change it to always on during training, which you can do that as well too. So it's more kind of I was using the raise to wake, which is fine, but I think battery life is kind of what I expect to see from that point of view. The mapping feels pretty good overall, very similar to what I've seen on previous Polar watches. Maybe not the most detailed mapping that available on a watch, but ultimately I think it's good to have it there, and the back to start feature worked very well. The only issue really I had was that just getting to grips again with where the settings lie on Polar watches, and accidentally hitting the lap button when I wanted to kind of pause and kind of look for the mapping features. So far seems pretty solid, kind of what I expect to see from a kind of mid-range sports watch and running watch, and seems pretty good so far with the Vantage M3.
So I'm just back from my first run with the Polar Vantage M3. Going to run through some of my first thoughts on the watch, starting with the design, which I do think is pretty nice. Like, it's a good looking watch. That screen is certainly bright and really pops. It's a little bit smaller than the one on the Vantage V3, but still big enough, really clear on the run and outside the run. The watch itself is quite thick for a small watch, but it's not unpleasantly so. It's actually a bit thicker than the Vantage V3 by my eye, but it is still comfortable on the wrist, and overall it's a pretty elegant watch. I don't like the strap it comes with the double pin design. I don't like that. I found that uncomfortable, so I've now swapped on a Vantage V3 band instead. Design is one area where the Vantage V3 has a clear advantage with the bigger screen, the nicer, more elegant, thin design as well, but the M3 is a pretty good looking watch, I would say. For my first run, I took it out for an easy 50 minutes or so in my local forest. There were some fairly tricky bits for GPS in terms of single track under tree cover. I was comparing it to a couple of other watches on the run. I had the Polar Vantage V3 on my other wrist to look at the GPS between those two, and then I had the Forerunner 965 on my hand connected to the Polar VeritySense armband heart rate monitor to compare that to what the M3 read on the run. One little note before we dive into those details is that you still can only have 4 stats on a data screen on Polar watches, which I find really annoying. Like, I like to have 5 stats at least on my data screens, but something that you can get on every other watch, but not with Polar. GPS locked on nice and quickly. Like I say, the watch was nice and bright on the run. I think I had it on raise to wake. I'll put it on always on for future runs, and then the maps were nice and clear on the watch as well. Comes to some very initial thoughts on the accuracy of the watch after that one run. Like, the GPS looks really good, very much in line with the Forerunner 965 and the Polar Vantage V3 throughout the run today. In terms of the overall distance and pacing each kilometre, it all looked very similar to the other watches. Can't see any big faults on the line. So do think Polar has figured out this dual band GPS after quite a rough start with the Ignite 3. I think was the first watch that had it and wasn't very accurate at all. I think the configuration on the watch now, along with the chipset, is set up to give you nice, accurate results. Heart rate was mostly pretty good for me too. Like, it generally read more or less in line with the Verity Sense. Like, it wasn't exactly in line with the armband monitor, but it was pretty close. I think there was only one time or a minute or two where it read notably too high compared to the Verity Sense, but it wasn't something that really pulled me miles out into a different heart rate zone. Overall, the zones all looked correct, so I think the heart rate was pretty good on that first run there today. And a little note on battery life so far. So I charged it to 100% at 4 p.m. yesterday. I think I had a period where it was on raise to wake, but mostly I've had it on always on since then, obviously not overnight. And at noon today, it's dropped down to about 81%. I think we are looking at about 20-25% of battery drain per day if you are using it for running as well. So yeah, it's not going to be the longest lasting AMOLED watch. That's in always on mode. You might be able to extend it a little bit with raise to wake, but Polar watches tend to be quite intensive in what they do overnight. So I think you're always going to have fairly fast battery drain with a Polar watch, especially with an AMOLED screen, I would say.
So I'm just back from my first run with the Polar Vantage M3. I actually split that into 2 runs. I did a 1 hour steady run, and then I did a mile with kind of 4 splits, like a mini interval session with 4 laps of my local park just to test the heart rate. I've also been using the M3 for a couple of days, and I've done a couple of cardio sessions with it. Now, first up, a quick word on design. I think this is a pretty good looking watch. It's relatively light, it's compact, it's comfortable, and despite being a little smaller than the Vantage V3, the AMOLED screen here is bright, it's punchy, it's a huge upgrade on the M2, and it brings your metrics and the maps to life in the way that the duller old school screens really don't. The touchscreens and the buttons have been nicely responsive for me, but I really like the raise to wake, which probably won't come on, it has. The raise to wake is prompt to respond, which means you can switch off the always on screen outside of workouts to save battery power. That's what I've been tending to do in these tests. All my interactions with the watch have been happily swift and lag free, and from what I've experienced so far, it's a neat design and a well delivered package for the price. So then on to the nitty gritty test, starting with the battery life. I've been using the Vantage M3 with raise to wake on, so all the battery life findings that I'm about to talk about here take that into account. So far, the overnight battery burn has been relatively stingy for me, averaging just 3%. That is in line with what I found with the Vantage V3 when I tested that. A 1 hour run in the most accurate performance power mode burned 5% on the M3. That was higher than the average 3% that I got on the Vantage V3, but obviously this is just one test that I've done with the M3. So far I've had the watch on for 2 full days and it's down to 67%. That includes an hour and 15 minutes run time and 4 hours cardio workout time using the heart rate, but set to raise to wake. On the GPS, I put the Polar Vantage M3 up against 2 dual frequency packing watches, so the Garmin Fenix 8 in its most accurate mode and the Apple Watch Ultra 2. Now the Fenix 8 logged 6.47 miles for that 1 hour run I did. The Apple Watch Ultra logged 6.36 miles. The M3 was 6.39 miles, so they're all well within that margin for error. So far, so good on that front. And when you dig into the tracks, the Vantage M3 does a good job of pinning me to my route. And I'd say it was as good on this run, if not better, than the Apple Watch 2, which did sort of stray at points. The M3 also handled a tricky series of underpasses much better than the Garmin Fenix 8 and the Apple Watch Ultra 2. So that really kind of bodes well as well. It was an interesting finding. When it comes to the optical heart rate performance on those early runs up against the Garmin HRM Pro Plus chest strap and the Apple Watch Ultra, it was a mixed bag for the Polar M3. As you can see from during the steady run that I did, the chest strap actually had a bit of a wild start, and then the M3 and the Apple Watch Ultra 2 at that point were close to my real world intensity. But once everything settled down, I think what you really see is that the M3 largely tracked the chest strap beat for beat throughout most of the run, but there were a handful of spikes that were quite big in places. It also failed to track a couple of drops in heart rate. Things like when I stopped at traffic lights, you can see there are periods where my heart rate comes down on the chest strap. It doesn't as quickly or at all on the M3. For the intervals, the M3 also went a bit wild. I could see in real time it had my heart rate too high at the end of intervals, hitting 189 beats per minute at times. Now that'd be really close to my HR max, if not above it. And I wasn't pushing all out by any means. You can also see there's one spike here when I got moving again for the very slow half mile home after those intervals. And again, the chest strap was way more on point for that with my actual intensity. Obviously, more testing is needed of the optical heart rate, but that's not the best performance that I've seen so far. We'll be putting that through its paces a bit more to find out if that's consistent. It's obviously very early days in testing, but for me, the early signs for the Vantage M3 are good overall. I think it's a good looking watch at a competitive price for an AMOLED screen in a relatively compact and stylish package with a finish that I think's, you know, comparatively subtle. It's nicely done. It's perhaps not as clean and stylish as the Vantage V3, But with that unified platform and the same hardware as the V3 and the Grit X2 Pro, I think that's really what Polar is doing here. With all the features the same, it really wants you to make the choice on size, materials and the design. But having said that, that's if the performance is on par, and that's something we'll have fun interrogating with the M3 for the full review. Now, Polar has recognised that it needs to make watches that appeal to a wider audience, particularly women, and that's why they've gone for a slightly more compact watch here. And I think the styling of this, thinner, lighter and brighter than the M2, somewhat speaks to that. And I think the Polar has kicked on things nicely here in the Vantage M3, ticks a lot of the right boxes at this price point. The optical heart rate hasn't blown me away, the GPS accuracy looks to be solid, and I'm glad there's no laggy raise to wake, and the snappiness of tapping and swiping is up there with the rivals now. Much more testing to be done, but my initial response for the Polar Vantage M3 from those early tests is this could represent good value, particularly if you really want an AMOLED screen.
So some initial thoughts off that first run with the Polar Vantage M3, and we're talking about ultimately Polar's kind of mid-range watch here. A mid-range watch now has an AMOLED display, and if you look at the price, it's kind of playing around up against things like the Garmin Forerunner 265, which is more expensive, has an AMOLED display as well. And I think you're obviously going to talk about the Suunto Race S here, which is cheaper than the Polar Vantage M3 as well. And I think in terms of sitting with those watches, it seems about right. You know, obviously you're getting kind of full mapping support, which you don't get on the Forerunner 265. All the kind of key kind of Polar training metrics here as well too. The heart rate so far, you know, pretty easy going run, looked okay for me as well too. So that seems to be a positive as well. I think crucially for me, what I want to see is how that GPS fares over longer testing. I think the heart rate as well too. I think crucially the battery life of that AMOLED display, you know, because I think ultimately what we've seen with the Race S and the Forerunner 265 is, doing pretty well in terms of having that AMOLED display on at all times. You know, what we've seen with Polar's watches, it's not been the same case. It can drain pretty quick when you do have that always on mode. So I would like to see, you know, I would be curious really to see how that kind of performs over time. But it feels like well priced. It's, you know, when you look at the Suunto Race S though, it's a shame it hasn't gone a little bit more aggressively against the Race S, because that is a very good watch. And I think at that mid-range kind of level, I think that's probably the one that the Polar Vantage M3 is up against. But yeah, I feel like this is, you know, the changes you're getting from the Vantage M3. Well, I kind of like the Vantage M2 kind of approach in terms of design. I think in terms of the added features and, you know, not taking that price too high with those added features, and it is more expensive than the M2. I think, you know, it's sitting well with the competition. Is it the best option at this kind of mid-range kind of price? You know, only time will tell and more testing. But yeah, it feels pretty solid overall. My kind of first run with the Polar Vantage M3.
So some very initial thoughts on the Polar Vantage M3 compared to the market at large. I think this is a good move from Polar to come in with a mid-range watch with some really good features here. You've got that nice AMOLED screen. You've got maps, which is, you know, a really big standout feature here compared to Garmin at this price point. And overall, I think it's going to be a competitive watch looking at this mid-range area. Certainly a lot better, I think, for sports tracking so far than the Polar Ignite 3. Looking at the Vantage V3, you've got like a much nice design. You're spending a lot more for that watch, but you are getting a much nice design. You are getting, you know, a sleeker looking watch with a bigger screen. But I do think the key sports tracking elements and those maps now having come to the Polar Vantage M3, you know, really make it a competitive watch in Polar's range compared to the more expensive options. Then the big competitor outside of Polar at this price is the Garmin Forerunner 265. It's a little bit more expensive, but you've got the AMOLED screen on there. You've got lots of Garmin features there, but you don't have maps, which you do get on the Polar Vantage M3. So that's a big point of comparison in Polar's favour, but it's not a point of difference to the Suunto Race S, which is actually even cheaper than the Polar Vantage M3. It's a really good value watch that. I think it's got a slightly nice design and better materials than the Polar Vantage M3. You are getting maps, you're getting very accurate dual band GPS on the Race S as well, so that's going to be a very strong competitor to the Vantage M3. Also in this area, you've got the Apple Watch Series 10, which is obviously more of a smartwatch. You've obviously got a very nice design on the Series 10, an amazing screen, really good smart features, but shorter battery life and less impressive sports tracking than the Vantage M3. So I think it's going to stand up pretty well in this category, but whether it can really beat out the Garmin just by having those extra maps or offer an upgrade on the Suunto Race S, which is a fair bit cheaper, that's something we'll get into more in our full review down the line. But yeah, enjoyed my first run with the Vantage M3 today. Looks a good addition to Polar's range.
So that's been our quick first look at the new Polar Vantage M3. We'll have a full review up on the channel just as soon as we're done with all of our thorough testing. We like to give these things a proper thorough going over before we give you our full verdict. You will need to subscribe and ring the bell to hear when that video lands. Get on with that, go do it now. In the meantime, let us know in the comments what you'd like us to look at in the review and we'll try and take care of that. If you're looking for a new running watch, I'm going to pop a video up on the screen now that you should definitely check out. Go and watch that. Lots of instructions coming from me in this outro. Otherwise, anyway, thanks very much for stopping by, and until next time, happy running, people.